Hey, you're here sewing with Cody and Pete, and today's video, this is part 2 of the BERNINA 570 and 590 brochure overview. And remember, if you like the video or like any of the videos, always just give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to see more videos. It helps other people see the videos, and also it helps the channel. So let's get started. So this video, we're going over the sewing and quilting portion of the brochure and basically of the BERNINA 570 and 590. So as I mentioned in the first video, I don't have the 590 here with me, but I'll definitely cover what makes those different from like the 535 and what's different about them, those two in particular. The biggest difference at first glance is the 590 has a black cover, or this one has the silver cover. So let's get started. So the first thing is the pattern start and end function. So both the 535, 570, and 590 have this function. So the pattern start or pattern end is basically, here's our pattern end, and once we start sewing, we have the pattern begin on the screen. So what that does is, like right now, we have a flower stitch on the screen. So if we want to finish stitching that current flower that we're on, for instance, we can hit the pattern end button. The pattern end button will then light up, and then a little stop sign will appear on the screen, and the machine will finish that pattern we're on and then stop. Now this is also programmable, which will see the pattern end programmable. So by default, when you press this, it will just finish the pattern and then stop. But you can go into the settings and tell it, okay, once you finish that pattern, I also want you to tie it off or cut the thread and raise the foot up. But personally, I just want it to stop because I may want to pivot my fabric or I may want to start stitching a different pattern. So if it's cutting the thread and raising the foot up, it's doing functions that I just don't want it to do, because all of those things, I can always knot the thread, I can always cut the thread, I can always raise the foot up, but having it do it all by itself may not be what I need. And I may forget that I have it set to do that when I press that button. So the next thing is something that is unique to the 570 and the 590. And this is the triple stitch. This is really, really cool. So the 535 cannot do this. So what this is you can take any stitch and turn it into a triple stitch. So we have a number of stitches that are on there on the machine twice, and one version is a single stitch and the other version is a triple stitch. But now you can take every version and make it a triple stitch. Now, not every stitch will stitch out nice as a triple stitch. So you kind of have to use your best judgment and see what you think would stitch out great as a triple stitch, because most of your satin stitches are not going to stitch out nice as a triple stitch. It's just too much stitching. But definitely try out the stitch as a triple stitch on a scrap piece of fabric before you actually stitch it on your sample that you're going to be working with. So to do that, so right now we're at the flower stitch. So we're going to hit the little eye. And so typically you're going to be on this screen. So just scroll up a little bit and you're going to see that triple stitch right there. So it shows the 3 lines. When we click that and it turns yellow, now when we stitch out that pattern, it's going to be a triple stitch. So it's going to be a nice bold flower, which is really cool. So this is something that's new with the 5 series. Something else that the 535 doesn't have is pattern elongation. This is a wonderful feature. So with the 535, if we want to make this flower longer, because we can't make it any bigger because it's already at that 9 millimeters, but if we wanted to make it longer, you could use your stitch length knob and just stretch it out. But that's exactly what it does. It just stretches out the pattern. So with the 535, we could do pattern elongation. I'm sorry. With the 570, we can do pattern elongation. And that's this triangle right here with the arrow pointing up and the arrow pointing down. So by clicking the pattern elongation button, we can then increase 1% at a time, or we can do 100% at a time. And what it does, as you can see, it makes the pattern longer, but it also fills in those stitches. So when you look closer, you can see that the stitches are much closer together, they're just not stretched out. Now, some patterns, or basically some designs, will allow you to make your design significantly larger. So this particular flower only let us increase by 100%. There are some patterns that allow you to increase it by like 1,000%. So let's see if we can find some of those. So I think some of these satin stitches will let us do that. Yes. So if I hit 100%, so I can keep on going. So what it does is it basically elongates the pattern, but fills in those stitches. Because one thing to remember when you're on a Bernina with a touchscreen is the pattern we see on the screen is exactly how it's going to stitch out. So you can see how full it is, opposed to just stretching it out, how it just opens it up. It will keep its full satinness, but you can increase it up to 1,000%. And it'll stitch out really long. So that's a really, really neat feature because customers always ask, like, can I make my pattern bigger? And you can't make it any wider, not until you really go up to like a 790 or an 880. But you can make it longer. But then again, you don't want to just stretch it out because then it can start puckering your fabric. But with pattern elongation, you can elongate it and have it fill in the stitches, and it lays much flatter. So that's a really, really nice function. So the next thing is the pattern end program, which we talked about. So it's programmable. So the pattern end, like we talked, this is the pattern end button, and it will allow us to program what it does once it finishes that pattern. That's something the 535 doesn't have. It's not programmable. It does have it though. So here's a total number of stitches, and this does include the alphabets. So the Bernina 535 had 1,048, the 570 has 1,450, and the 590 has 1,774 total number of stitch patterns. And we'll break it down a little bit more further down. So just like the 535, all the 5 series have memory in short term, and that's altered stitches. So basically what that means is if you're at a straight stitch like we were, so when we turn on the machine, it automatically goes to a straight stitch, and earlier we altered it. We changed it to a zigzag, and we went to other stitches as we saw. But when we just went back to the straight stitch, it kept it at the settings. It kept our needle position. It kept our stitch width that we changed. It kept our stitch length that we adjusted. And that's a temporary altered stitch memory. All of our Bernina machines have temporary altered stitch memory. It's wonderful when you work on a project and you're adjusting the stitch, but you're kind of flip-flopping around with different stitches, and it always remembers previous stitches, not just the previous one, but many previous stitches that we were working with, how we changed them. It also has long-term altered stitches, so we can save it for the long term. Either we can go to the heart and say, okay, I want to save that stitch, select a folder, and it'll save it in that folder. You can always go and retrieve it. But you can also save it another way, which is a really neat function. And that's right here. So we went to our eye, and we can click our floppy disk. So what this does is it saves that particular pattern as a new default. So when you turn on the machine, or you turn it off and turn it back on, and you go to this specific stitch, it's always going to be saved until you hit this floppy disk with the line go through it, is that it will always be saved how we left it. So basically you change the default, which is really nice. So if you're doing some applique projects and you're working with a blanket stitch, and you always like that blanket stitch set a certain way, and that's kind of like the only way you want to use it, you can have it set like that, hit the floppy disk, and what it'll do, it will save it. So every time you go to that stitch, it will be set exactly how you left it. But everything is temporary. You can always reset it. And to reset it is basically this button here, and it resets that stitch. But a question I get is, so if you did change the default of that stitch, you can always go and change it to a different setting. It's not locked at that setting. But when you do clear or turn off the machine, it goes back to that new default that you have saved. So you can create and save stitch combinations. We did this on the 535, and almost all of our Berninas can actually do this. And that's if we hit the plus sign, we can go and select different stitches, and we can start combining them and add them together. So that's the combine, and we can save those the same way we save other stitches by saving in our folders. So you can change stitch settings while you're sewing. What that means, so as you're sewing, you can make that stitch length tighter. You can make that stitch length longer. You can change the stitch width, and you can move your needle positions while you are sewing, which is nice because you move that needle position over instead of stopping. A lot of it's just in the act. You just click the button, and it will change it while you're in the act of sewing. So that's the function on all of our Berninas. So here's where we get to some of the stitches. So utility stitches. The Bernina 535 had 30 utility stitches. The 570 has 34 and the 590 has 38. So utility stitches are basically the stitches in that first tab. So as we can see here, it's listed as 34, but all of those stitches in here are basically utility stitches. And I refer to these stitches as a stitch with a purpose. So most of these stitches are designed and have been designed many, many years ago to do certain stitches. And you can always hit the question mark and ask them, what is that stitch? So that's a stretch stitch. And it'll give you some other options, like the 18 is also a stretch stitch, but it's designed for sewing stretchy fabrics, so it won't pop that stitch when it stretches. The other thing are buttonholes, and this includes the eyelets. So the 535 has 14, the 570 has 16, and the 590 has 18. So our buttonhole stitches, including eyelets and buttons, so on, is right here in our buttonhole tab. So you can see here are our different buttonholes on the Bernina 570. So just like most of our machines, most of our Bernina machines with the touchscreen, is we have the automatic buttonhole length measuring system. So if we select a buttonhole, we can come to our letter I, little I, and we can adjust the length of the buttonhole and the opening, that gap of the buttonhole. That's something that we couldn't do in the 535. So we can come here and we can place our button on the screen. And when we place our button on the screen, we can use either knob and change the size of that yellow circle to match our button. I actually did this today when I made my shirt, and I needed to make the size of my buttonholes. I just placed my little button on the screen and made the circle the size of my button. And it worked out beautifully. The buttons fit through there perfectly. And so all the Bernina machines have an automatic buttonhole, which means, so you set the size, you put the number 3A buttonhole foot on, which we can see right here, and it will make that buttonhole the perfect size every time. But it also has a manual multi-step buttonhole, which we can use, which we can make much larger buttonholes if we needed. It has a button sew-on program, so that's using foot number 18, and it's stitch number 60. And what it does, it uses a set width of the holes in the button, because most buttons, the holes are the exact same size apart. Just about whatever size normal button you're working with, if it's tiny or if it's larger, it's kind of like a universal hole distance on the button. So you're able to use stitch number 60 to sew on that button. And foot number 18 is the foot design for that. So it has darning functions, just like we saw on the Bernina 535, and most of our Berninas have that. So the darning function, so we have some automatic darning functions like 22 and 23, and you can set it the length you want to do, and you can use your automatic buttonhole foot to do those darning programs. Now as for pure decorative stitches, so the Bernina 535 had 300 decorative stitches, the 570 has 450 decorative stitches, and the Bernina 590 has just a little bit more at 500 decorative stitches. So our decorative stitches are going to be a lot of these in these folders. So these folders contain multiple stitches. Like there's even a holiday folder with the new Bernina 570 and 590 that has a lot more decorative stitches. And with it being a 9mm stitch width machine, you can make those decorative stitches nice and big. The 535 had 31 cross stitch stitches, 570 has 34, and the 590 has 40. So your cross stitch stitches basically will be in your 300 folder. So we've got a few more cross stitch stitches here than we did in the 535, but the 590 has a little bit more. So as for sewing alphabets, so the Bernina 535 had 5, The Bernina 570 has 9, and the 590 has one more at 9. So you can go and select different alphabets, and these are sewing alphabets, remember. So these can only be a max stitch width of 9 millimeters. So the height of these alphabets can't be any taller than 9 millimeters. But that's a great size if you want to make little labels or quilt labels, something to sew in a garment or whatever. This is a perfect size. You don't have to go to embroidery to stitch out different alphabets. And you use a combination mode to combine these stitches to create names and words. So this machine, just like the 535, has sewing tutorials. So that can be found in the sewing tutorials. You've got basically your creative, you've got creative consultant as well. So your creative consultant is here. So you tell it what fabric you're working with. So let me go back. So the creative consultant is a little mannequin. So when we click this, you would tell it what fabric you're working with. Say a medium weight knit. You would tell it what application you're going to do. Let's say we're going to do a zipper. It's going to tell you your needle size, your thread, what stitch to use, what foot to use, and then you may require some stabilizer. So if you hit the check mark, it's going to adjust all those things for us plus some. So some of the things that things that adjusted are our thread tension. It changed our foot. It also adjusted our pressure foot pressure. This is something the 535 cannot do because it cannot adjust our pressure foot pressure because it's a manual adjustment. So here it dropped our pressure foot pressure because we told it we're working with a knit, and a knit at a high pressure will stretch. So we reduce some of that pressure so the fabric doesn't stretch nearly as much, or we try to avoid the stretch completely. Also, it lengthened our stitch and it moved it over to the right. So all we have to do is basically change needle, thread, and the foot, and we're good to go. So it changed everything else for us. And sewing tutorials. So if you have questions, we have an on-screen manual again. So if you have questions on like embroidery, attaching the embroidery hoop, there are a lot of things that will show you videos or show you pictures. So these are our sewing tutorials. They're found in the built-in manual. So again, that's it for the sewing and quilting video on the Bernina 570 and also the 590 machines. Again, if you like the videos, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. It helps out the channel. It helps other people see the videos. Stay tuned for the next installment of the 570 and 590 brochure overview. And until then, happy sewing.